Embrace the Truth back with us. And over this course of the hour, like we have done through the course of the month, we hope to be able to explore all the questions that you may have. And so wherever you are and wherever you're joining us from, hopefully we can find some answers to the questions you have regarding Christianity. And so if you do have any questions for us, you can submit it in one of two ways. You can either send a text message to the number that's displayed on the screen, or you can also scan the QR code and just fill out the form to ask your question. And over the course of the next hour, we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can. Our guest this morning probably needs no introduction as he was with us last week, but again, Abdu Murray, as an attorney, international apologist, and the president of Embrace the Truth International Ministry, and also a Christian author. Just as he shared with us last week, his background from a proud Muslim through a 9-year journey that pointed him to the Christian faith. And so we're very glad, Abdu, to have you back again. And just before we start off with the first question today, just any remarks that you would like to give before we begin?
None other than just thanking you, Aaron, and everyone over at SCAC for the opportunity to just spend the couple of weeks together with you. It's been truly an honor and a pleasure, and hopefully the topics that we've talked about, both in the actual messages, but also during the Q&As, have been helpful to you, not only to strengthen your faith, but for those who either you know or people who are listening to this, who might be struggling with something and a very serious question that they've always wanted to ask. I hope that you've gotten some answers, both from my good friend Alicia Wood and from me, and then from anybody else you've explored and asked these questions of. And I just want to encourage you that the Q&A does not stop. Obviously, the Christian faith is a life of learning, and it's a life of humility where we know and we have to wake up every morning realizing there's so much more we don't know than what we do. So don't let it be the case that if you hear me or you hear others or you read books that you think that this is the end all be all of all the answers. The beauty of the Christian faith is that it allows you to go into so many different things, to look at so many different questions from so many different angles, because it affords to you an infinite amount of learning, which is a good thing, because the infinite God, who is going to be with us for eternity, ought to be giving us surprises for all of eternity. It's hard to fathom that there'll never be an end to the discovery, but because of the delight of that discovery, we will get to enjoy an infinity with the Lord in that way. And that does not have to wait until heaven. That can start right now. So after this Q&A and explore what the Lord has to offer, he offers nothing but a bounty of not only learning, but of encouragement in your life.
Great, thank you, Abdu. And so, yeah, we'll get right to the questions. There are quite a few today as well, and so that's great to see. And again, just keep asking throughout our time, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So the first one that we have this morning says this. So this person asked, what's the best way to share Christianity with non-believers or people who subscribe to other faiths? And maybe I'll just add to that as well, especially after your talk for us this morning, where you had a lot of cited a lot of sources, things like that. But for someone who may not be as knowledgeable or be confident to be able to say and give so many points, what would be the best way to share and talk to someone about Christianity?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, and thank you for that. I want to say that it was either D.L. Moody or A.W. Tozer, I can't remember who it was, who was asked by someone, if you only had 3 years in which you knew you could preach the gospel, how would you spend them? And he said, I'd spend the first 2 years preparing. Now, obviously, we don't need to have that kind of a time constraint, but what their point was this, is that sharing the gospel is a process that is the end of the process. The actual proclamation of the gospel, the actual sharing of your faith at that point, is actually the end of the process. The process that begins with preparation. So having seen this, having been a part of the series for this month, hopefully is a foretaste of what you want to get involved in terms of finding out what it is that other people believe, why they believe it, and why they object to the Christian faith. So bathe your mind not only in scripture, and that is the primary thing we ought to bathe our minds in scripture and prayer, but do pray about other people. And again, I forget the quote from whom it comes, but it was an interesting thing that someone said. It is more important to talk to God about people than it is to talk to people about God. And the idea there is that you are to pray just as fervently as you can for God to give you wisdom and guidance and insight into what a specific person or a particular person actually needs to know. Or needs what their even their physical need or their life circumstance need is, because when you meet that, oftentimes it opens up the credibility for the answers. They might see Christ moving in you, but wants to know: is it just you are a nice person, or somehow is Christ impelling this kind of behavior? So spend time bathing yourself in prayer and asking God for opportunities. The Apostle Paul did it in Colossians 4 and in numerous places where he actually asks for the opportunities to share the gospel with boldness, but wisdom as well, to know who you're talking to and what their actual issues are. I would suggest we do not let labels. If someone's a Muslim, or someone's a Hindu, or someone's a Buddhist, or someone is an atheist or an agnostic, don't let these labels dictate to you every aspect of how you actually share with someone, because you'll walk in with a set of preconceived notions about what their hang-up actually is. I have found many people who will have a religious moniker. They'll have a religious name around their neck, so to speak. They would call themselves a Christian, or they would call themselves a Hindu, or whatever it is, but deep down inside, they're really just quite agnostic about the whole thing, and they're not even sure about organized religion at all. But then there are people who would say that they're atheists, but really they're agnostic, or they say that they're agnostic, but they actually affirm that there is no God. And so you have to, I think, the first and fundamental thing, beyond prayer, beyond preparing yourself by reading apologetics materials, by reading evangelism materials, after all of that, and even while you're doing that, when you're engaged with someone, ask them questions about themselves. It's important that we find out what a person actually thinks. Let me give you an example. Is when I encounter Muslims, for example, given my background, it happens quite a bit. When Muslims have basically 4 objections or 5 objections to the Bible, or sorry, to Christianity, that center around kind of the same thing over and over again. Everything's a variation on these 5 things. But the chief one of which is that the Bible has been changed. The Bible has been corrupted. It was once God's word, and they believe that because the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, actually mentions the Bible. It mentions the Taurat, the 5 books of Moses. It mentions the Injil, or the Gospel of Jesus, and it mentions the Psalms, the Zabur, the Psalms of David, as divinely inspired words of God. The Quran speaks highly of the disciples as well. But Muslims believe that their message was inherently changed and corrupted to include things like the Trinity and the incarnation of God in Christ, that Jesus could not be God, that the cross didn't even happen, let alone that Jesus rose from the dead. So Muslims believe that the fundamental message of Christianity is actually the message of Islam, but it got perverted and changed. So the text of the Bible changed. That's something almost every Muslim who takes Islam seriously believes. But it's interesting because I've actually had conversations with people who would say they're Muslims, who have a high level of reverence for the Bible, but don't really even know what it says, or don't even realize what the Quran itself actually says in terms of its compliments of the Bible. And so I often ask them, what do you think of the Bible? And why do you think that when you think about the Bible? And they'll say, oh, it's been changed, or whatever. It's like, well, did you know that the Quran actually references the Bible in very positive terms, as if it was in existence at Muhammad's day and a trustworthy source of knowledge? And they'll say, really, where? You see what I'm getting at here is that oftentimes you think you know something, or you assume something about what someone knows or someone thinks without asking them a question. So if someone says the Bible's been corrupted, the Bible's been changed, the first thing you ought to do is not rush to defend the Bible. The first thing you ought to do is put the burden back on the person who made the claim. So when someone makes a claim, they bear the burden of proof. If a Muslim, for example, or anybody, even atheists, say the Bible's been changed, now that follows a question. Sorry, a question follows that. You don't start to defend the Bible and say, no, it hasn't, and here's 15 reasons why it hasn't been changed. What you ought to do is say, why do you think that? How do you know? What sources? Where? Who changed it? For what purpose? In what way? You see what's happening here is that you're actually getting someone to start thinking through their own worldview. Now, maybe they have thought it through, which is great because now you can have a real conversation and you can keep asking questions and stay in control, even if you don't know everything about a particular topic. But if you ask questions of someone to make them back up what they say or what they believe, you'll understand that person better, you'll understand their position, and then you'll be ready with a response that actually addresses the issues they actually have. So I would say that the first thing to do in answering a person or trying to share the gospel with a person is find out what their felt need is, find out how the gospel fits into that felt need, find out what their worldview actually is, and ask questions about why they believe what they believe. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what you have to find out is not only their felt need, what is it they need in their life, whether it's physical stuff or it's emotional and existential issues. Ask them, has your belief satisfied you intellectually and emotionally? And find out where the gaps are. And then you can wedge the gospel into the gaps, and pretty soon those gaps become bigger and bigger, but the gospel becomes bigger and bigger, and it begins to fill those gaps in as well. So get to know the people you're talking to. Remember, you're not answering a worldview. You're not answering a religion. You're answering a specific person. And every time you do that, you will make progress when you answer the person, but you have to find out who that person is. Don't let the labels make the difference. You know, it was, let me finish with this. F.W. Borum wrote one time about the way we analyze people. He said that we label someone a Christian or a skeptic, and we think that that settles the matter. We hang this invisible sign around their neck and think that Christian or skeptic, that solves it. He says, but the reality is our work is far more complex than we think. And then he quotes the Bible and he says, we have this story where a man says, Lord, I believe. There you have the saint. He says, but help me with my unbelief. There you have the skeptic. Oftentimes, a saint and a skeptic can lodge in the self-same heart. So don't make assumptions about people. Find out who people are, and you'll be surprised how easy it actually is to share the gospel with them when you've taken an interest in them, not just their worldview.
Sorry. Yes. Thank you for that, Abdu. This next question that we have, I guess, is maybe a bit more of a personal in nature, referencing your message to us this morning. What are some clues that you yourself have experienced in the physical world that point you toward God?
Yeah, and this is probably taken right off of the part of the talk when I talked about what Peter Berger referenced was signals of transcendence, that the physical world actually points to God. I shared a couple of stories. I think that things that I've discovered or I've learned from other people, like the eclipse that covers up the sun and allows us to see things that we otherwise wouldn't see. And it's just no coincidence that the only place in the solar system that has people on it to observe phenomenon is also the only place where the observable phenomenon of a solar eclipse actually happens. So as I begin to see the world around me, I begin to see not only evidence of God's handiwork and his design, but I also see evidence of God's work in my own life and in the life of those around me that is actually quite miraculous. So not only do we have science that tells us that this universe began, that it began because choices were made, and that there is a design in mind that will allow for human life. But I think the other physical aspects of this in my own personal life, I think this is asking a personal thing, is I've seen people receive miracles in answer to prayer. I've also read the medical journals. One thing I didn't talk about before was the way in which there's actually a growing body of literature in the medical journals asking about the efficacy of prayer in healing people. We've seen this happening where, for example, there was an article that was done about a man well, he was a young man, but for his whole life, he couldn't digest anything. He needed a J tube to be inserted into his stomach, which connects his esophagus to his duodenum and his lower intestinal tract, because he just simply couldn't eat anything. He just couldn't do it. This was a very serious medical condition, and nothing was working, and he was unable to digest food, unable to do that without the help of this tube. Well, some folks prayed for him, and he suddenly could eat. This is actually in an actually documentable medical journal. And so this was such a shocking thing. And the phenomena that are happening, it's happening far more commonly than you might think, caused the editors of this medical journal to basically say there needs to be some publications and some studies done on the efficacy of prayer for healing. So the signals and the clues that are out there is that the world is breaking down. The laws of entropy are such that things go from order to disorder. That is basically a law of nature. Things don't go from disorder to sudden order. Things don't just suddenly assemble themselves, as it were, without some kind of intervening action. But things do fall apart without any intervening action. Physics is just that way. If you leave something alone for quite a time, it might last for thousands of years, but eventually it decays and eventually it goes away. The reason why miracles like this are a signal or a clue of God is that it's a reversal of the physics. A miracle is not the most unlikely event. That's not what a miracle is. A miracle is simply defined as the natural world being acted upon by a supernatural being in a way that does not comport with the laws of physics and the laws of science. So the fact that things go backwards or opposite the physical world is really important. A good friend years ago, his wife was diagnosed with leukemia, and it was a pretty serious condition. He showed me the lab report, and then he said, we prayed for my wife, and she was going to go in for some testing, and she had some blood work done, and the blood work showed that the leukemia was gone, and that the radiation treatment had worked, because there was some evidence, I guess, of some kind of the radiation treatment. My friend told me, he said that was a miracle because she had never undergone any radiation treatment. And we were confirming that this was actually her blood work. And they confirmed, yep, this is her blood work. And so the treatment seemed to have worked, but there was no treatment. There was only prayer. So I see this happening in people's lives all the time when there are miracles that are happening. Now, does this happen for everyone? No. I've prayed for plenty of miracles that didn't happen because God is teaching me something in these things. But I have seen this happen. A good friend of mine, Nabil Qureshi, who's passed away, sadly, from stomach cancer some years ago, he came to faith miraculously as he had dreams and visions of the Lord. And he had revelation of Scripture before he even read those portions of Scripture. So there's so many ways in which God inserts himself into the physical world that show us clues that he exists and that he's in control of this physical world, and this physical world is subject to him, and that he's not subject to our opinions, but our existence is subject to his existence as well. So those are just a couple of things, I think, that I've experienced or I've seen, both I've read, but also have encountered people in my own life, not to mention the ways in which God has divinely intervened in my life in ways that are just uncanny, where circumstances come together. And I say this, by the way, just let me finish with this, is that I'm actually an inherently skeptical person. When someone claims to have experienced a miracle, whether they're a Christian or not, I typically tend to be a little skeptical, looking for a naturalistic explanation first. It's like, well, did that mean something to you because you needed it that moment? Or, was it really the situation as bad as we thought? And, just to see, I want to make sure that we don't overstate the case for miracles. But I don't disbelieve in them. So my point is that we can easily discount a miracle if we don't allow for them at all. But if we are skeptical of a miracle, that's fine, as long as we're willing to acknowledge that one could have possibly happened. And then we look at the evidence and see it. So I have, in fact, seen things in my life, some clues in my life, in the physical world that have pointed me towards God. The very fact that this world even exists. I mean, give you an example of something real quick too, is we're doing this via Zoom. I'm doing this on a laptop, and laptops are probably, and other devices are probably tuning in. The fact of this technology is pretty amazing. But every single thing that's being done right now is designed. And the fact of the matter is that this didn't happen by accident. These machines are nowhere near as sophisticated as any part of our body or any part of our brain. And so if these machines that allow us to do this across countries are designed, how much more likely is it that our bodies and our brains are designed, since our brains and our bodies are the ones that created the very machines that we're looking through each other at right now? So I've seen plenty of clues in my own life. And in fact, I'm experiencing one right now.
So I guess maybe just as a small follow-up to that, so like for the, we say average person, like are these clues there? Is God present like this for everyone, or is it our skepticism that prevents us from seeing it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Aaron. And I think that's the way I would look at it is, yes, I think that there are, the Bible does tell us a couple of things, is that most unbelief, if not all unbelief, is not it does not occur because someone does not have access to the truth, but it's because of a suppression of the truth. Paul says this in Romans, is that oftentimes, and this was my own case, by the way, when I was a skeptic of the Christian faith, it wasn't because the evidence wasn't obvious. It was because the evidence was a little inconvenient for me. And so I did not want to embrace it because it would actually have a consequence. And so I think oftentimes this evidence is available to people. It's just a matter of whether or not their heart has been so changed or their ears are so open as to whether they're actually willing to see it. Let me give you an example of something of a story. There's two stories I want to give really quickly. The first one is that I had a colleague, a coworker of mine, who was a good friend, a good man. He was very, very funny, always had a dry sense of humor. But whenever a natural disaster would happen or something would come up, he would walk into my office and he would say something like, "Oh, I see that your God just dropped the roof of a church on a bunch of his followers." He basically saying there is no God. He was an atheist. And he was basically saying a bunch of things like, there is no God, and here's why I don't believe in this God, and et cetera, et cetera. So he would do this every so often and walk out of the room. And finally, he did it one more time. So, whoa, hold on. You got to stop. You can't play the game for free. I have to ask you some questions now. So we sat down and I asked him some questions. Now, I happen to know that this guy smokes, and he's a lawyer. He actually knows evidence. He knows the rules of evidence, and he knows how this works, and he knows how juries think and all that stuff. So I said, when did you start smoking? He said like age 17 or something. I said, so you and I are roughly the same age, which means that you had all the information I had, that smoking was both harmful, it could actually kill you, and it was addictive. You had all that information, right? He said, yeah. I said, you had the evidence in front of you? He said, yeah. I said, so let me ask you, what would it take for you to believe in God? He said, I would need like a big golden cross in the sky that everyone in the world could see, and that John 3:16 would emanate almost like over a loudspeaker from this golden cross in the sky that said that God loves me this much. So that would convince you? And he said, yeah. I said, it's interesting that's what it would take to convince you, given that you knew that smoking could kill you and that it's addictive, and yet you did it anyway. In other words, evidence didn't matter to you. Your desire mattered more to you. You see, the point here is I'm trying to make is that the evidence is actually available for all to see. And Blaise Pascal put it so beautifully. Blaise Pascal, who is a philosopher, a scientist, and a Christian of decades past, said that God has left enough information in this world to make it so that you can believe based on evidence, but he's left enough out such that belief based on reason alone is impossible. In other words, you have to be able to rely on him and trust him to a certain degree. And that's the whole thing about faith that I talked about as well. So I think it isn't just that the evidence is not available. I think the issue is that as we see more and more evidence, sometimes we see more and more skepticism, and that can frustrate us because it's like, why is that? And it's not because the evidence isn't there. It's because the evidence has a price. There's a consequence to actually embracing that. And I see that with brilliant people who have not embraced the truth, not because the truth isn't there, but because they want to suppress it. Desire is often a bigger determiner of belief than evidence actually is. The second story I was going to say was that a young girl came to our office, her mother brought her in, and she had ironically actually lost her faith when she went to Israel to spend some time there. And it's a far more secular country than people realize. She lost her faith came back and was sort of militant about it. And she wanted to see a miracle. And so I had asked her, well, what would qualify as a miracle for you? And she said, I said, because you're looking at one right now, the very fact of your existence. And I went into the design argument. And eventually she came to the point where she was like my friend. She needed to see something so undeniable that it would leave every doubt laid to rest. The problem with that, as I told her, is that you're moving the goalposts. You don't believe anything like that. You don't believe anything with that level of certainty. I mean, I asked a question essentially, and it was, so do you believe that your mother is your mother? She said, yeah. So do you remember that? Do you remember actually your birth? And do you actually remember seeing her face and saying, that's my mom? Or do you just take her word for it? You could be adopted. You might look like her. Maybe that's just convenient. Or maybe she's your aunt. Maybe she's your sister. There's a big cover up going on. All that is possible, right? Yeah. So you don't have certainty, but you have enough good reasons to believe it. I think that's the big issue, is that we have to come to faith in God, not based on absolute, without a doubt certainty, because there is no such thing this side of heaven. But we come to faith in God based on the probabilities and the preponderance of the evidence and God moving in our hearts as well.
Thank you, Abdu, for that. And as we move on, this next question asks, evolutionary biology and Christianity, can you believe in both at the same time?
Sticky one. Yes, thank you for that. Let me just say up front that evolution, I don't think, is a dividing line upon which we need to start labeling people heretics or non-Christians. I think this is very, very dangerous. In fact, Francis Collins, who I've cited in many talks on Christianity and faith, himself believes that we've evolved, that God was in the process of evolution, that God did not leave it to chance, as it were, but God was involved in the process. And there are many people like that. There's a group called Biologos of scientists who actually believe that evolution did occur. And I mean macroevolution. And this is an important thing. We have to make sure that we understand the differences. Because when we use the word evolution, it's a broad category of things. We have evolution of thought, like my thinking has evolved on this issue, or my tastes in music have evolved. This is not a bad word. It just means that things have changed over time. I actually think that no one denies that microevolution happens. Microevolution is simply variation within a species. So as an example, the very fact that we actually are of different ethnicities. And I was standing in your congregation, and except for me, some of my guests, and my wife, when we were there, almost all of you were Asian. That is variation within a species. Now, technically, I'm actually Asian because I'm from the Middle East, and we have to be attached to some continent, and Asia happens to be the continent I'm attached to. So I guess in one sense, all of us were Asian, except for my wife, she's European. But you get my point, is that there is variation within the species. And that isn't controversial. That's not even an unbiblical thing. That's completely to be expected, because ethnicity is something the Bible speaks about quite a bit. Even variation within certain animal species. We have different breeds of dog, but those dogs are not going to grow wings and suddenly, give birth to something that can swim underwater and breathe that way or whatever. Macroevolution, not micro, is not variation within a species. Macroevolution is the idea that there are certain variations within a species such that the variations genetically begin to make a difference and make one of the variants able to compete better than the other variants within that species. And then that variant's progeny suddenly become far more abundant. And then they change, and all the little micro variations eventually change into a huge variation, like gills turning into lungs, like scales turning into feathers, and these kind of things. So this is an important distinction. It's important to know what we say, what we mean when we say evolution. But as I said, there are plenty of Christians who I think are Bible-believing Christians who think the Bible is the Word of God, inspired by Him, who take it seriously, who actually believe in evolution. I am skeptical of it. I'm skeptical of it for several reasons. I think that there's a lack of evidence that would conclusively point to anything close to macroevolution. I remain skeptical of it. I remain skeptical because I think the math and the actual chemistry doesn't add up. There's a number of things that I think fly in the face of it. For example, origin of life issues. Leave aside the evolutionary issue for a moment. The origin of life itself, by blind chance, is just simply, I think philosophically, it's just, I wouldn't say it's an impossibility, but it's so incredibly unlikely that it requires a bigger miracle than God intervening in the world. Origin of life researchers have a perennial chicken and the egg problem, because in order to get recombinant DNA that allows for, and RNA and all these things that allow for evolution to even be a thing that could possibly happen, you have to have proteins like synthetases and these kind of various macro molecules that are proteins that allow for the zipping and unzipping and the recombination of DNA. In order to have those proteins, you need to have DNA first. But in order to have DNA, you need those proteins to create recombinant DNA. So you have a constant cycle of a chicken and an egg thing. Even in RNA, it's still a problem. So my point is this, is that there are people who believe in evolution, who believe that evolution actually occurred, but they remain Christians because they believe that the process could not have started without God, and that God had us as a pre-vision in mind, that we were meant to be here, and God knew the process would create us this way. Now, having said that, I don't necessarily defend that position. I think it might have some theological problems to it. I think that there's some issues with it with regard to Adam, and was Adam an actual person? And there are people who have wrestled with this. William Lane Craig, for example, and Joshua Swamidath have actually written some books on this, the quest for the historical Adam. I would also recommend to your reading, if you're interested in this topic, things by Reasons to Believe, who are a group of scientists who do believe that the Earth is millions and millions of years old, but don't really ascribe to an evolutionary paradigm. They think God specially created human beings without the process of evolution, and they remain skeptical. And among them are astronomers, astrophysicists, biologists, biochemists, etc. So I would highly recommend Reasons to Believe. Also looking at William Lane Craig's work on the historical Adam. I tend to sort of go with more of a Reasons to Believe approach in terms of how they think of Adam and Eve as literal, actual people who were humans, fully human, like you and I are. Having said that, there is a wide range of opinion. This is a long answer to a short question, but the question has such broad implications, because within the body of Christ, I think it's important that we don't divide so much over these issues that we start to divide the house of God up into who believes in evolution and who doesn't. Do I think there's problems with evolution? Yes, I do, scientifically. Do I think there's problems with evolution theologically? Yes, I do. But do I think that you can be a Bible-believing, faithful Christian and a good scientist and believe in evolution? I also believe that too.
Thank you, Abdu. And I guess this next question may be in a way a follow-up to this one. And so the question goes, I understand the argument that life wouldn't have started without all the finite variables at exactly what it's supposed to be, and say that it must be intelligent design. If it was intelligent design, why is everything also so broken and destructive?
Excellent question. And that's a fantastic question. I think part of it, I think there's a complex answer here, but let me just try to make it as simple as I possibly can, but not simplistic. I want to make sure I respect the depth of this question, because it is a deep one. The consequences of the fall exist, are actually there. What I mean by that is that when Adam and Eve are placed in the Garden of Eden, they are told to work it. I think we get this picture of Eden as this place where Adam and Eve just basically lounged around on hammocks and ate fruit all day and didn't have to do anything. But that would be a terribly boring existence. They worshiped God, and they actually tended the fields, and they took care of the animals. When they were banished from the garden, when the tree of life was no longer available to them, decay started to set into the world. In other words, God lifted his hand of protection, and the physical laws of the universe began to take over for humanity, for human beings, for the rest of eternity, for the rest of human history, until there is a new eternity and a new heaven and a new earth. And Eden lost will be Eden restored, but even better, because it'll be universal in terms of those who are saved. So I think that the result of sin that we have decided that we want to live in a broken world. We've chosen to remove ourselves from God's protection has resulted in these things. Now, does that mean that there was not animal death before the fall of Adam and Eve? No, I mean, it's possible when you read the Bible. It doesn't necessarily mean, maybe there wasn't, but it's certainly possible that there was animal death or, bacterial death or whatever it was outside of Eden. Through one man, death entered the world, and sin also, but for humanity. Many would say that when death enters the world, it's relative to humanity, not relative to the rest of the world, which means that there were some things, there was predation. Some would say that animals preyed on each other before Adam and Eve's fall outside of the Garden of Eden, in order to prepare the world for the apex predator, which would be humanity. Because once we get into the system and once we get into the rest of the world after we leave Eden, the rest of the world has to be prepared for us. And in fact, what's interesting is when you don't see predators in a certain ecosystem, when the predators are removed from the ecosystem, that ecosystem tends to die because predators allow for a balance. All that is to say this, is that the world as we see it relative to human beings is broken, and things don't seem to be working in terms of some of its destructive nature, because I think of the consequences of the fall, because we chose to live in a world that was no longer protected by God. We chose to be sovereign. Think about what the Adam and Eve story is all about. Adam and Eve were told one thing: of every tree of the fruit of every tree in the garden you may eat, except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Of that fruit you may not eat. That's it. That's all the commands they had. And they might have lived with that for who knows how long, not tempted by it at all. Along comes the serpent. The serpent says to Eve, did God really say? And he sort of misquotes God. And then what Eve does, and by proxy her husband as well, what Eve does is she misquotes God back. She said, God said, don't even touch it. Well, he never said, don't touch it. He just said, don't eat it. And so Eve took it upon herself, and Adam took it upon himself to add rules to what God had said. In other words, they wanted to be the sovereign over God. That's what you do when you add rules to God, is you want to be the sovereign. And so suddenly the fruit became tempting because the serpent told them, the day you eat of it, you will not die, but you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And that's when they wanted it, because they wanted their autonomy. They wanted to be the God of God. And that's why the world is the way it is, because we have chosen to be God, be the God of God. We have chosen to be the masters of our own world. And this is the world that we get because we chose, and each one of us would have chosen the same thing, to remove ourselves from God's sovereign hand of protection. So Eden was protected because of God's sovereign power, and because of God's sustaining power. It was protected from brokenness. It was protected from destruction. It was protected from decay. But we chose to protect ourselves, and we're not very good at it. We're not powerful enough to do it. So I think that's part of it. There's also a design element to the whole thing. Plate tectonics, which can be destructive at times, actually created a world in which human beings were habitable in the first place. And so I think this is all part of an intricate plan where God allows people to look for him and search for him in the midst of destruction, in the midst of brokenness, but also in the midst of the beauty, in the midst of the design that's all around us. So the question itself is such a good question, because while the brokenness and the destruction is bad, it presupposes that things should be a certain way. The destruction and the brokenness shouldn't be the way it is. And anytime you say shouldn't, you imply a moral standard. And if you imply a moral standard, then you're implying an absolute morality. And that morality must be based on something outside of us. It has to be baked into the universe itself. And so I think the design of the universe points to what God had intended for us to be a beautiful, harmonious, Edenic setting. But the destruction points to what we intended for ourselves.
All right, thank you, Abdu. Switching gears a little bit now, this next question, I guess, addresses some of what's been going on very recently in the US. So how do you feel about the recent Supreme Court decision and abortions? So the
Yeah,
overturning of Roe versus Wade.
yeah. I feel a lot about it. I feel a lot of different things about it. But I'll say that a couple of things. Let me just say up front that I think this is a historic decision, that I, as a believer, and I, as somebody who was a pro-life, by the way, before I even became a Christian, um, I can rejoice in the decision because I understand the decision and what it actually means. This is not an imposition of my Christian worldview on other people. I think it's based on solid legal principles, and I think it's based on scientific fact. We see this word all the time, follow the science, follow the science, follow the science. Well, the science tells us something. The science tells us at the moment of conception, at the moment the sperm fertilizes the egg, you have a being that comes into existence with 46 chromosomes, like, if all things are going well, like every other human being in the world. And so that fertilized egg, that zygote, is actually a person. It's actually a human person. Now, if it doesn't have a mouth yet, or that he or she can't give you their opinion, or whatever it is, doesn't mean it's not a person. Because if we based personhood on level of development, then we could actually say that your value is less the less developed you are, which means that a 2-year-old is less valuable than a 7-year-old, is less valuable than an 18-year-old, is less valuable than a 45-year-old, or that someone with severe mental challenges is because of developmental issues, is somehow less valuable than someone who doesn't have those same developmental challenges, or that someone who's bigger, stronger, faster, and smarter is somehow more valuable than someone who's not as big, maybe a little slower, not as physically gifted, and maybe not as intellectually gifted. So you can't base it on level of development. And I think that's what the science actually tells us, that size, location, level of development, all of these things, they can't determine what a person actually is. But objectively speaking, you can say without opinion that a person comes into existence when the egg is fertilized by the sperm. It creates a 46 chromosome human. So then the question becomes, what is abortion? Abortion is the ending of that human's life. And so you have to have a justification for that. Because that person didn't do anything other than exist. They didn't ask to exist, and they didn't invade. This person is just there. Now, for various reasons, and we can go into the various things like, rape and incest and all that stuff, but that person is there. And how they got there should not be the dictation as to why their life should end. There needs to be a valid justification, like they threatened the life of the mother, for example, and that kind of stuff. So the reason why I rejoice over this is because it is essentially a statement that says that the Roe versus Wade opinion, and Casey versus Planned Parenthood, that opinion itself as well, basically codified the idea, or from the judicial bench, said that states cannot prohibit abortions in their state. You have to allow it. In other words, the states can't decide for themselves. What the Dobbs opinion does, what was overturned, was that states can decide for themselves. In other words, it overturned the holding of Roe, which said that states cannot decide for themselves if abortion should be outright illegal. The federal government is a constitutional right to it. Well, all Dobbs said, this most recent decision, was that under the United States Constitution, there is no right to an abortion. And when you read it, there is no such right. You have to go through a lot of, I think, tortured legal reasoning to find that there is a right to an abortion in the United States Constitution. It just simply isn't there. So the Dobbs opinion recognized that. It's a return to saying, what does this document actually say? The second thing it basically says is that states can now decide, each individual state can decide whether abortion should be illegal, or whether there should be any kind of restriction on abortion, or no restrictions on abortion. Those states can decide. In other words, the people, the electorate, the people who decide who gets in office, they can decide individually for themselves. So in the state of Michigan, for example, which is where I live, abortion is legal. The decision 2 days ago doesn't change that. the legislature of Michigan might change it, and now it's allowed to. We are allowed to change it, or we're allowed to keep it. That's what Dobbs was all about, and that's what the opinion is about. So I rejoice in the sense that that life, I think, has a chance now that the people can choose. In other words, their choice is now back on the table, as it were, as far as the legal process goes. So I rejoice in the fact that there is an affirmation that there can be life, and states can choose to say we are pro-life and we do not support the ending of human life in the womb, absent extreme circumstances like the death of the mother or the risking of the life of the mother or other such exceptions. There are some exceptions that I think where abortion could be justified, but they're very, very, very limited. However, having said all that, let me make sure I'm clear. The rejoicing is a tempered rejoicing. It is not something, it's not to be gloated over, to be used as a gloating thing. It's not a victory. We wave a flag and gloat. I think that we're given too much to that lately. Whether you're on the right or you're on the left or you're a centrist, whatever it is, we're given the gloating over our cultural victories and making those who disagree with us feel like you lost and you deserve to lose, and it's a shame you even thought the way you did, or whatever it is. And that's created such a polarization. I know Canada suffers from this, and I know the United States does. Most of the world is suffering from this intense sense of polarization. Social media has made it ugly. It really has. So the rejoicing has to be tempered without gloating, but it has to be tempered by this too, by compassion. Because there are women. If the statistics are right, many women before the age of 35 will have had an abortion. Many, not most, but many, a surprisingly high number. That means that, and the science also shows, the research also shows that most of these women have very serious psychological and physical after effects after having an abortion. So they don't just have a procedure, they walk out and everything's fine and nothing's changed about them. There's something that happens after an abortion that we have to recognize. And so now that it is no longer required to be legal, because we'll make it clear, Dobbs did not make abortion illegal in the United States. It made it a state's issue, whether it could be illegal or not. But those women need our compassion, need our care, and need our understanding, not to affirm what they've done, but to affirm them as human beings, made in God's image, for whom he offers solace, hope, peace, healing, and redemption, just like he offers it to you and to me. And for those who have considered it or are considering it, there's a reason why people say it's a very tough decision to get an abortion, because it's not. I think deep down inside, we know it's not the same thing as getting a mole removed. You're not simply taking tissue and removing it from your body. There's a reason it has a psychological effect. And so I think what we need to do is make sure that those who are in anguish over this, or those who even have fear that suddenly all their rights will be taken away, that we express the truth of what this kind of a decision means. Now, of course, the Dobbs decision has no impact on what Canada does, legally speaking. It might have a cultural impact. It might be the start of something. But all that to say is that we have to make sure we understand that there are people who actually might, whether they're Christians or not, and usually not, who might be saying this is the start of an avalanche of making women into baby machines and putting them, barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen and all this stuff. This is important for us to say this is not what this means, but it actually means liberation and flourishing for women of every race and every creed and every culture, if we understand what this is really all about. So this is not a time for gloat. This is a time for a tempered rejoicing that life has been affirmed and that we can actually make these decisions, but that also we need to temper it by the fact that there are those who are afraid, but there are also those who don't understand what's going on. And it gives us an opportunity to share our convictions about why. I get the opportunity now, and my kids do as well, to say why they're pro-life, and my wife does, with a compassion and a conviction at the same time. That's what's important. So I feel I'm very happy about this decision, but I think that I'm relatively unhappy in some ways about our reaction to it, about the gloating, but also the yelling and the screaming and the anger about it, and taking to the streets with violence. So the decision is good. The reaction's not so great, But I think that once we settle down and calmer voices start to take over, I think we can move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Abdu. And the question that we have next is a follow up on that, and maybe based on the reaction, like the gloating that you referred to, that for all Christians, perhaps whether or not we gloat or not will be lumped into that the same group, and further this maybe divides us from the rest of the world. So the question here, how do we ensure we don't go from Christians who show God's love to just perpetuating Christian nationalism?
Wow, what a great question. It's a great question. It really is, because it's so easy to slip into the Christian nationalism. It's so easy in one sense. And the reason why it's so easy, let me just give a breakdown into this. So we can understand how to avoid the problem if we understand the actual problem. Christian nationalism is not the idea that you're proud of your country, because you can be a non-Christian and you're proud of your country. And there are people who are non-Christians who are very proud of their country. I'm very proud of the United States. I'm also critical of the United States. The point is that when you're a Christian, you recognize something. You have to recognize something as a Christian. In fact, my first book was almost entirely based on this principle, is that as a Christian, I have a biblical anthropology. What that simply means, it's a very, very fancy way of saying I have a biblical view of humanity. And that biblical view of humanity is that all are sinners and have fallen short of the glory of God, no matter what country they live in, no matter what family they were born into, no matter what they believe. All are sinners and fall short of the glory of God. And that until we are sealed in that redemption in heaven, we will continue to be subject to that sin, not to the same extent. And yes, sanctification is real, and God is working on Christians, if they're sincere about their faith, day by day. But the reality is this, and this is part of the Christian experience. We have to make sure we are self-reflective. And I don't mean self-deprecating with no good reason. I mean self-reflective. Take a look at who we are. Understand who we are. The Bible requires us to take a look at ourselves in the mirror all the time. Compare ourselves to the standard we're trying to become. The Bible tells us that we are to be conformed into the image of God's Son, of his suffering, and yes, even his death on a cross. To be as he was, who did not think equality with God as something to be grasped, the Bible says, but lowered himself and took on the form of a servant. That is important, because what we have to do is ask ourselves, how much like that am I? The Christian faith is a constant waking up every morning of self-reflection. I saw a friend actually posted something on Facebook where he said, I get up in the morning, I wash my face, I look in the mirror and I say, you don't know anything. You know almost nothing. And that humbles me. And then I experience the world around me, which confirms that I don't always know people. I don't know everything about everybody. Now, not everything. Certain things are certain. You know who Christ is. You know the Holy Spirit. You worship the Father. We can know plenty of things. But in comparison, we have to be humble and realize we don't know everything. My point is that the way to avoid a Christian nationalism is to constantly engage in self-reflection. You can be proud of your country. I'm proud of the fact that the United States was founded on the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that these are inalienable rights endowed by our Creator. That's what the Declaration of Independence actually says. Now, that's not a legal document, but it is a declaration of what independence is all about and being free from tyranny. That's a thing that we should be proud about, not in a prideful way, but proud of the fact that we're blessed to be as a part of that. And that document would not have flourished in a secular culture. That document would not have flourished in other non-Christian cultures. In other words, the blessings of the good, I would say, of Western culture is because of the Eastern religion of Christianity. Now, there's plenty of bad that we have to lament, because those are inconsistent with Christian, I think, teaching. So I think a healthy self-reflection of that which is good about our countries, whether it's Canada or the US, or other Western countries that were founded essentially on Christian principles. They're not Christian countries in the sense that they're theocratic, They're just founded on some very consistent Christian principles. That's a good thing. But the Christian faith requires us to constantly examine. So when I see the country that I love, that loved me back and gave me opportunities, when I see it going astray, I have a duty as someone who loves the country to point that out, to point out the flaws, to point out the issues, to point out the problems, to point out when our leaders are not living up to the principles that make these countries good, when the countries do in fact go from good to maybe not as good. So I think this is an important thing for us to understand. And if we focus ourselves on self-reflection as a culture, that we recognize that there is Christian nationalism is a temptation to slip into equating love of patriotism and our Christian faith. And they're not the same thing. You can be patriotic, but if you allow your patriotism to compete with your allegiance to Christ, you are dangerously coming close to idolatry. You are dangerously coming close to having the nation be almost as important as God. You know, there's a movie, the movie that inspired me to want to be a lawyer, called A Few Good Men from the 90s, where Tom Cruise played a lawyer in the JAG Corps, the United States Marines, and the Navy has a Judge Advocate General office where he's a lawyer. And he's defending these two Marines from a murder charge. And he asked them, basically, essentially, what drives you guys to do what you do at the Marine barracks you're so committed to, because they're very, very committed to it. And their code was this: unit, corps, God, country. So their loyalty to their unit in the military, then the loyalty to the Marine Corps, then God, and then country. That's screwy. That's backwards. That's not the way it should be. For anybody who believes that God is sovereign, the very unit of the Marine Corps that serves a country exists because of God himself. So he is the sovereign, and so he is the one who gets our first and greatest allegiance. And so Christian nationalism is a temptation we can fall into, given the media hype, given the divisiveness, given the polarization that happens here, given the fact that certain political parties might be more sympathetic to a Christian worldview, that we can easily slip into that. But if we as Christians maintain the desire over and over again to make sure that our allegiance first is to Christ, I am an American, but I am a Christian first. My being an American will be informed by my Christianity, but may it never be the case that my Americanness dominates or unduly influences what it means to be a Christian. That's the key. Your being a Canadian is something of a blessing from God. And it should never be the fact that you think that your being a Christian is somehow a blessing of being Canadian. That's not how it works. God is first. He's always first. We can only reflect his love if we recognize that we are imperfect, that our countries are imperfect, and they are subject to him. If we are to be, as America, a nation under God, not in a nation in competition with God or in partnership with God, we are under him. Christian nationalism becomes something that we would be able to resist.
Well, thank you, Abdu, for that. And looking at the time, we're nearing the end of our session. And so maybe if we just cover one more question, and we'll try to choose one here that, like, there are a couple of others I think that you, like, on and off touched on. And so we'll try to do one more where, that's a little bit more unique, we can say. So this final question that we have today was this: why should I trust God if it seems that I have control over on most things in my life? Obviously, there are things I don't have control of, but what's the point of following God?
Yeah, that's good. It's a great question. In fact, someone wants to ask me, what is the hardest question you've ever been asked? And oftentimes it's this one. What's the point if things seem to be, if I have so much control over my life, and things seem to be going really well? I don't have control over everything, but why should I trust God? Or what's the point in following God if things are going really well for me? There's a couple of answers to this question I think that are really important. The first is this: the very fact that you have control over most things in your life is actually a nod to the fact that you have free will. Okay. What I mean by that is this, is that if you can control things, if you can make decisions about how things should go, what school you go to, how well you do at school, how well you do in your career, how do you interact with your family, your health, your eating choices, the various things you have in your life, you have control over, let's say, 80% of your life. I actually think it's probably not true, but let's just say we feel like that. We have 80% of control over our lives. The fact of the matter is then that you are making choices. Now, if there is no God, then you would be like a deer or like a snake or like an eagle. You don't actually make choices. You respond to instinct, just like they do. Even the highest primates there are, chimpanzees, they form troops. The baboons form troops. So there's a troop of chimpanzees and they take care of each other and they get angry and they even kill each other. But they don't actually have the ability to set aside that and say, you know what, I'm going to actually stow my emotions, think this through, and try to reconcile with my brother. Chimpanzees just simply don't do that. They don't wonder about the physical world. They don't sit there and wonder about what the rings of Saturn are made of, because it does not help them get more bananas or get more mates or produce more progeny. They just don't do that. But you and I do. Here's my point. This is why I say this. The very fact that you and I have control over anything means that we have free will, which means that we are somehow greater than and ontologically more special than animals. Now, if we just did things because they're evolutionarily advantageous, well, why do we wonder about what the sun's core is or whether Pluto should be classified as a planet? We have these wonders and these desires and this morality because we're something different. In other words, we're imbued by a creator. So the very fact of our free will shows that we're not chemical machines like every other animal in this world. There is something of a soulishness in us. So the fact that we have any kind of control actually points to the sovereign controller of the entire universe, who endows us with the ability to control some things, but subject to his sovereignty. And one of those things is how you choose to respond with the control you've been given. It was Abraham Lincoln who made an interesting statement. He said, if you want to test someone's character, you don't give them adversity, you give them power, you give them control. If you want to know what someone's made of, you give them control and you give them power. And so God has given you and I control over many, many things in this world, subject to his sovereignty, to see what we're made of, so that we can see what we're made of as well. And so the whole point of following God is that when you and I control things in our lives, we are going to make them a royal mess. If you haven't, just wait a while. You're going to find that the decisions you make are going to hurt people. You're going to disappoint people. You're going to hurt people. They're going to hurt you and disappoint you. You're going to make decisions you wish you never would have made. You're going to stay up in the middle of the night wondering why I did that. Why did I do that? I hope they can forgive me. All these things are going to happen in our lives. And so the fact that you have any level of control at all is going to be a reflection of just how much either A, we're not in control. Control is an illusion. Anybody who's ever gotten cancer can tell you control is an illusion. Anybody who's ever been told that their baby has a fatal birth defect and the baby won't last past 3 minutes after birth will tell you that this idea of control is an illusion. Because you might have control over which phone you buy, but you don't have any control whatsoever over whether or not a comet will hit this world or the big things. And so the point of following God is to recognize, what does control actually mean? What do my choices actually mean? Who am I before God? And the very fact that we abuse our control over and over again points to us that we need someone who never abuses his control, never abuses his power, to show us that we are not like him, that we are far fallen from him, but he has paid the debt that we owe. We've used our control not to help each other only, but oftentimes to hurt each other and to hurt ourselves. And so God says, if you follow me, if you embrace what my son has done for you, He has paid the debt for you. Then you will recognize what true control is about, what true control, tempered by grace, what true forgiveness and true justice are all about. And I think that's what the point is. We go about our lives, C.S. Lewis put it this way, is that we go about our lives fooling around with things like career and sex and pleasure. And we think that that's the best thing there is. But the reality is that there's so much more to this. There's so much more to this. It would seem, he says, that our Lord finds our desires not to be too strong, but to be too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, he says, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased. Your control is a shadow of what it means to have a joy to follow God, your and mine. So the point of following God is that we will eventually use our control to hurt ourselves and to hurt others, and to take ourselves farther and farther from the source of life. God shows you what real control is, and what real control exercised under his authority, under the morality that is dictated by the transcendent voice of the universe, what that really looks like and the goodness that comes from that. He's offering you and me not mud pies made in a slum, but a holiday, a feast you and I are meant to enjoy.
Well, thank you for that, Abdu. And I guess on that note, we have come to the end of our time, and we will conclude our Q&A for today. Just any final words or comments before we wrap up?
I want to thank you all for letting me be a part of this series. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to have contributed in any way. I hope that my contribution and that Alicia's contribution has been helpful, that has moved the needle for you, whether it's strengthened your faith, or it's moved a faith that was fleeting and just hanging on by a thread, or if you have you don't really have a faith in God, but you are someone who's wanted to explore this. I pray that I hope that this has been something of help to you. We remain open to interacting with you. Please do visit embracethetruth.org and contact us that way, and look at our videos online and these kind of things. Never stop exploring the questions. Even when you find answers, the answers are great because they solidify you, but they lead to more questions. Doesn't mean that you should be awash in uncertainty. No, the certainty of the answers you get, or the confidence, I should say, in the answers you get, lead to better questions and more profound questions, and a blossoming of your mind. So I pray that you engage in true worship, which is the bathing of your mind in the nourishment of what God has to offer you, and the bathing of your heart in the love God has to offer you. Thank you all so much for giving me a chance. We look forward to hearing from you, and I pray that we can interact again soon.
Yes, on behalf of the entire church and the English ministry here at Scarborough Chinese Alliance Church, we thank you, and we thank Alicia as well for these past 4 weeks. They've been very insightful, and we're greatly appreciative of your time, and also for actually physically coming up to join us last week as well on Father's Day. And so thank you for that, Abdu. Just as we wrap up, if you missed our service this morning or any of the services, or if you want to rewatch both the service or the Q&A, that just a reminder, they're all available on our SCAC YouTube channel as well. And so this week being the final week also concludes our series, Why Should I Care If God Exists? But like Abdu, there was a question you asked that did not get answered. You're by all means welcome, as he said, either if you want to try to connect with Embrace the Truth, to contact them, or you can contact us as well through our website, scac.org/em, and we would be happy to continue the conversation with you even after our series ends. And so thank you once again for joining us today. And thank you, Abdu. And we hope that you continue to ask questions, but also are inspired to share and to answer questions for those that God has placed in your life as well. And so thank you for joining us, and that concludes our time today.